takings, you get to have a jury decide. As a landowner lawyer, we never waive the jury. We prefer to have the jury decide what the just compensation is for the property and the business being taken. So, government, to get outside of a jury, both the government and the landowner have to waive the jury. In my experience, just compensation, unfortunately, the jury gets to determine what just compensation is, not the government. Just compensation, that's what it's all about as far as our practice is concerned. Rarely do we have a valid right to take a challenge. Rarely can we stop the project. If the project's going to be stopped, it's going to be stopped. For instance, for the high-speed rail project, it's going to be stopped now. It's not going to be stopped when somebody comes into my office who's had a complaint filed against them to take their property. When it gets to that point, it's rare that you can prevail on the right to take a challenge. So what is just compensation? Just compensation includes the fair market value of the property being taken by the public agency. Fair market value in eminent domain, it's a specific definition standard that only applies to eminent domain cases. This is not negotiations fail. What does the government have to do next to acquire your property through eminent domain? First, it will provide you notice as the owner of the property of the resolution of necessity hearing. So for the high-speed rail project, the board would have it would be a hearing before the board, and the board would have to adopt, or would have to pass by 2/3 vote the resolution of necessity. And basically, for the resolution of necessity, what the board is doing is it's finding that the public interest requires
stopping a project that's going to devastate your community and your individual property. And so I want to take us back to that point and suggest that you don't have to see yourself as a collection of individuals who Mr. Turner can't even really tell you what's going to happen to you, because he would have to get with you individually in his office and go through one by one all of the intricacies of your particular situation, because you're all hanging separately. My suggestion is the unity concept, which is let's hang together now and make certain that we don't have a high-speed rail project that runs on an elevated freeway-like structure right through the middle of every community along the San Francisco Peninsula, including my hometown, Palo Alto, and destroying property values and community values, the local economy, and the environment of these cities. You know, to tell you who I am and what I'm doing here, as I said I would do, I grew up in Palo Alto. I lived in various houses around the town as I did grow up, because in that era, prior to Proposition 13, a smart person, and my parents were smart, moved every 3 years to always upgrade the value of their property. And we went from what used to be the military academy on Parkinson to the top of Christmas Tree Lane on Seal, and then over to Crescent Park, and ended up on Edgewood. And I've never been in this council chamber because to me the city hall was on Newell Road. So I care about Palo Alto. I went not only to Palo Alto High School but also to Stanford University and Stanford Law School, and I ended up being elected to the Santa Cruz County Board of Supervisors when I was 29 years old, and I served for 20 years on that Board of Supervisors at a time when everybody was being told that there was going to be growth, there was going to be development, there were going to be new highways going through the middle of the city, there were going to be all sorts of things that were going to change the character and complexion of our community, and there really wasn't a hell of a lot we could do about it. And in fact, we did something about it. We completely altered the course of land use history in Santa Cruz County during the 20 years I was there, and I am here to tell you that if you hang together as opposed to hanging separately, it is possible to have communities make a difference for themselves about what happens to them. I am now an environmental attorney working in Santa Cruz, which is where I now live. I have in the meantime been the head of the Planning and Conservation League so lobbied at the state level in Sacramento on the environment. And I'm here because the Planning and Conservation League, which likes the idea of a properly constructed high-speed rail project because it has environmental positive benefits, is engaged in litigation, was engaged in litigation before, because they're not doing it right on the San Francisco Peninsula. Because as somebody who was very concerned about land use and planning matters, I happen to know that Palo Alto, Menlo Park, Atherton, Belmont, all up and down this Caltrain corridor, these are the kind of communities that the planners say are the best in the world, that we are all trying to create. And as somebody who grabbed me as I walked in the door here said, you know, I can't remember which relative it was a doctor. He says, you know the Hippocratic Oath, just like that, isn't it, Gary? What's the first commandment? Do no harm. Now, there's nothing going to be wrong with high-speed rail if it doesn't wreck all of the communities on the peninsula. And anybody who tells you, well, it's just so great and wonderful, it's going to solve so many problems in the long run, that we've just got to sacrifice this little zone of affluent communities who actually they can move out and go somewhere else. They have the wherewithal to do it. Don't you believe that for a minute. If California, in fact, does construct a high-speed rail project in California, and it's quite questionable whether they're going to be able to do it, but don't turn your eyes away and assume they're not, because I think we've got to assume they're deadly serious about it. If they do that, this is going to be the biggest public works project in the history, I think, of the nation, certainly the state, and it's going to be around for 100 years, and it would be absolutely stupid to build an elevated freeway through the middle of all of these peninsula communities that will be there for the next 100 years. And it isn't going to happen if the communities along this right-of-way say we're not going to let it happen. And they're going to say that, as your own city has started doing in a very effective and articulate way, if the community gets engaged and tells local elected officials, state elected officials, federal elected officials, no, do it right or don't do it. That's what the Community Coalition on High-Speed Rail says. Now, what's the status of this project? It's recently changed, and the status of the project up until September 2nd was, although they were planning madly to design a specific project and go through the middle of Alma Street and all of these things that you probably all know about, in fact, they had not even yet made what's called a program-level decision to go on the Caltrain alignment in Palo Alto and various other places. They now have made, the California High-Speed Rail Authority has made that decision on September 2nd, and I am very pleased to say the Community Coalition on High-Speed Rail, Atherton and Menlo Park, which previously litigated, Palo Alto now officially joining the fray, and others are going to litigate that decision-making process the way they litigated the last one. And as you may recall, everybody knew that last lawsuit was completely bogus. It wasn't going to happen, could never be victorious stopping this authority, and the lawsuit was successful. Now, these lawsuits aren't automatic winners, let me tell you. It's going to be a tough legal fight, and lawsuits aren't the way ultimately communities like Palo Alto are going to end up with the right kind of treatment in connection with this project, because they're procedural in nature, and if you win the lawsuit, the authority or the state has to go back and do it right procedurally, not substantively. What we want is a substantive good decision. And so I want to illuminate for you, if it hasn't been illuminated already, who's in charge. Because reading the newspapers or the blogs or listening to TV or the radio, you would think that Quentin Kopp from San Francisco and Rod Diridon from San Jose and a bunch of other people who you don't really know who they are exactly are in charge of this project, and the people have voted for it, and there is no doubt that it's going to happen because it's progress in the future and jobs for all and all of these great things. Well, let me just tell you that Proposition 1A, which is the voter-adopted measure that authorized, but did not actually commit the money, authorized the borrowing of almost $10 billion, mostly for this project. Proposition 1A started off with the High-Speed Rail Authority was going to be in charge of the money and the project. And as that proposition went through the legislature, before it went to the voters, the legislature changed it. And the legislature said, number one, we reserve the right to change who's in charge of the project. We're going to start off with a high-speed rail authority, which promoted the project, marketed the project, got the voters to vote for the bond issue, but knows nothing, frankly, about running a train or building a high-speed rail system or anything else. But the legislature said, and then the people adopted this, so it's the law, that the legislature can decide who's going to be in charge. And the legislature said, changed the law to specifically say this, you're not going to get the $10 billion and go out and spend it. You're going to have to come to us every time you want to make an expenditure, and they do this basically through an annual, it's supposed to be annual, budget process in Sacramento, and we're going to decide whether to give you the money or not and what it's going to be spent for. So when you understand legally where this project is, this project is under the control of the High-Speed Rail Authority, which is very gung-ho for the project. They like the idea, they sold it to the people of the state, and they don't think any, what some planners call externalities, matter. The project is so great in terms of its overall wonderfulness that all of the sacrifices in between are just minuscule and can be disregarded. Now, anybody that's looked into planning and so forth knows that when you have a business that shifts some of the actual costs to somebody else, they can make things happen and it appears that everything's great, but somebody else is getting the smog, somebody else is losing their land, etc. That's really not full cost accounting. And so the legislature essentially is going to ultimately decide if this project goes ahead, who's going to be in charge, and how is it going to be done, and how's it going to be paid for. And that means that our local legislators elected from the peninsula, one of whom is a former mayor of this city and is probably, if not the most, he is the second most important person in the entire state legislature on this issue. The people in Sacramento are going to decide what happens. How do they decide? And I am experienced as a statewide lobbyist. They decide based essentially on what they're hearing from their people, and not so much individuals, although that never hurts, but from the local government people who represent them. Therefore, when the city of Palo Alto recently adopted a resolution and said, we're not happy, we're not satisfied, we do not have confidence this is going in the right direction, and we're prepared to put our money, including litigation, where our mouth is on this, that sends a huge signal. Now, Atherton, Menlo Park have been doing that for a year. I'm just telling you, I am very confident when we get communities from Mountain View to Millbrae to say, you're going to do this right or you're not going to do it, that's what's going to happen. And that is what has to happen, because it would be a shame and a crime to build something that's supposed to be for progress, and in the process of doing that, essentially blight some of the best communities in this state. Now, here is what I think you can do about it. The Community Coalition on High-Speed Rail is not an information gathering group, it is an advocacy group. Its slogan is, do it right or don't do it. And they're very insistent on the second part of that as well as on the first. And doing it right to the Community Coalition on High-Speed Rail means that each and every local community directly impacted by this has to be satisfied in its own mind that this is acceptable and that the project does no harm. If it's going to cost some more money,